There are words of love that, if left unsaid, we will regret. But there are words of love that, when spoken, teach us how to grow. Have you ever carried a sentence in your heart for so long that it began to feel heavier than silence itself? A sentence you rehearsed in your mind 100 times, imagining how it would change everything, and fearing that it might change everything. There are words of love that, if not said, we regret for years. But there are also words of love that, when finally spoken, don't give us what we hoped for, and yet somehow give us exactly what we need to grow. He returned home after many years away, not as the boy who once ran down that narrow dirt road, but as a man who had learned how quickly time rearranges life. And at the end of that road stood the house where a girl once lived, the girl who had quietly become the center of his small universe. They had grown up side by side, not as lovers, not even as something undefined, just two children who shared afternoons, secrets, dreams that felt too big for their little town. In those years, affection had no name. It simply existed, natural, unforced, unexamined. Then one day, his family moved to the city. There were no dramatic goodbyes, no promises whispered under the stars, just distance and time. And sometimes, distance doesn't erase feelings. It preserves them, like a photograph, tucked safely away from the wear of daily life. As the years passed, he changed, he matured, he experienced the world. But somewhere in the quiet corners of his mind, she remained untouched by reality, a memory unchallenged by adulthood. Now, standing again in his hometown, he realized something unsettling. He wasn't just visiting a place. He was revisiting a version of himself. The boy who never said what he felt. The boy who assumed there would always be another chance. This time, he told himself, would be different. He had come back with a decision to finally speak the words he had carried for so long. But beneath that decision lived a quieter question, one he hadn't fully faced yet. Was he confessing to her? Or was he trying to resolve something unfinished within himself? That evening, they sat next to each other, the way they used to, close, but not touching. The conversation flowed easily at first. Familiar stories, shared laughter, small updates about work, family, the ordinary rhythm of adult life. On the surface, nothing had changed. But inside him, everything was different. He noticed how calm she seemed, grounded, present. She wasn't the frozen memory he had carried for years. She was real, shaped by her own experiences, her own disappointments, her own growth. And suddenly, he became aware of something subtle but important. The image of her he had loved for so long existed mostly in his mind. Still, he began. His voice was steady at first, but the deeper he went, the more he felt the weight of each word. When we confess something vulnerable, we are not just revealing feelings. We are revealing our need, our hope, our fear of not being chosen. Her eyes shifted slightly, not cold, not rejecting, just surprised. A quiet confusion passed over her face, and in that instant, something inside him tightened. This is the moment many of us recognize. The split second when we realize that what we feel so clearly may not be mirrored back to us. He paused. He chose silence, not out of cowardice, not because he feared rejection, but because he sensed her uncertainty, and he did not want his confession to become pressure. Over the next few days, he tried to behave as though nothing had shifted, but internally, something had. When feelings remain unspoken, they often transform into unfinished narratives. The mind replays them, rewrites them, imagines alternative outcomes, and unresolved emotions have a quiet way of draining us. He began to understand that his struggle wasn't just about whether she loved him back. It was about whether he could face the truth without losing himself. And that is a far deeper conflict than rejection itself. In the days that followed, he realized something quietly unsettling. Silence had protected her comfort, but it had not given him peace. He could continue pretending, continue preserving the friendship exactly as it was, continue carrying the weight alone. And many people do. They choose emotional safety over clarity. They convince themselves that love is more noble when it remains hidden. But unspoken feelings don't disappear. They settle into the body. They become tension in the chest, restlessness in quiet moments, a subtle resentment that has no clear target. And he did not want that. So when they met again, there was no dramatic setup, no rehearsed speech, just honesty, stripped of expectation. He told her that he cared about her deeply, that those feelings had existed for years, quietly, without demand. He didn't ask her to decide anything. He didn't try to persuade. He simply allowed the truth to exist between them. Confession is often misunderstood. Many people see it as a gamble, a risk taken to gain love in return. But psychologically, it can also be an act of self-integration, a way of aligning your inner world with your outer reality, of no longer splitting yourself between what you feel and what you show. She listened carefully. There was no discomfort in her posture, no urgency to escape, just attentiveness. And then she spoke gently. She valued him, she always had, but her feelings lived in a different space. To her, he was family in spirit, a friend who represented safety, shared history, trust, and she did not want to redefine that. And that's the answer that so many people fear. And yet, nothing shattered. He felt the initial sting, not dramatic, not overwhelming, but real. Rejection does not have to be loud to be meaningful. It can be quiet, dignified, almost respectful. The pain wasn't about humiliation. It was about letting go of a future he had imagined. But as he listened to her, something else became clear. She wasn't rejecting him as a person. She was simply honoring her own emotional truth. And in that realization, he faced a choice that defines maturity in relationships. Would he interpret her honesty as a wound to his worth? Or would he see it as an expression of her autonomy? He chose the second, not instantly, not effortlessly, but consciously. Because real love, he began to understand, is not measured by reciprocity. It is measured by whether you can care for someone without needing to control the outcome. When the conversation ended, there were no tears, no dramatic farewell, just a quiet acknowledgement that something important had been said and respected. And in that space, he felt something unexpected, relief. Not because he had gained her love, but because he had finally stopped hiding his own. When he left that day, the world looked exactly the same. But internally, something fundamental had shifted. He did not walk away as a man who had failed. He walked away as someone who had integrated a difficult truth without collapsing under it. And that is a subtle but powerful distinction. He confronted vulnerability without manipulating the outcome. He allowed himself to feel deeply without demanding control. And when reality did not match his hope, he did not distort reality to protect his ego. He could have responded differently. He could have withdrawn in resentment. He could have convinced himself that she had missed out, but instead, he chose respect. And respect, especially after rejection, is one of the clearest indicators of psychological strength. Nothing broke that day. A friendship remained intact. A man walked away clearer, and somewhere within him, a quiet strength took root, the kind that does not come from being loved back, but from loving well. Love isn't about possession. Maturity isn't about being loved in return. It's about being sincere and still respecting the answer, even if it's not what you hoped for. If you've ever kept something unspoken in your heart, share your story in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel to explore more stories about growing up and loving.